This is very nice.
Isn't that lovely?
Welcome, everybody. My name's Kathy Jensen, and I am with the Caring Connection. We kind of do work for the last maybe 7 years in Cardston, putting on some programs and things for caregivers, or just supporting families and people in relationship, actually, sort of thing. So we've invited Bill Harder from the Hospice Society in Camrose to come and talk about caregiver fatigue. Now, he knows himself really well, and he said he would do his own introduction. So thank you for coming. All right. Bill, take it away.
Thank you. Before I launch, I want to acknowledge, and I don't actually know, so I have to ask my Blackfoot sisters, what treaty land are we on here? 7? Okay, I want to acknowledge that we gather on Treaty Land 7 in Blackfoot territory. And with that, our deep gratitude that we share this land. Thank you. So, I want to introduce myself to you, and then I will quickly ask a couple of questions of you. I work as the program coordinator for the Hospice Society of Camrose and District, and I do grief and bereavement work for them as well as program development. It is my utter privilege to be with people in their lives when they are facing trauma. Sometimes that trauma is a death, sometimes it is a life-limiting illness, a palliative diagnosis. Sometimes it is some other kind of loss. And it is a sweet experience to sit and hold your hands out and receive the suffering of another person. And to know that we cannot necessarily stop that suffering, but we can share in it. And there is a cost to us to hold our hands out gently and receive somebody's tears, their story, their pain. And it is that cost that I want to address with you today. In very, very brief, my background. I am born in Edmonton, raised in Westlock, which is an hour north of Edmonton. Little town about this size, a few more trees. And I went from Westlock to Camrose, where I did schooling, and then I did some degrees, which taught me a few things, but life taught me a whole lot more. I had a 12-year career in parish ministry, and then I transited into compassion fatigue and funeral work and hospice. So what I come to you with is an openness to hear and to learn from you. It is obscene to invite an expert into a community and have the expert tell you how to live. I do not come that way. I come to your community humbly, and I will engage you in conversation, and together in this day we'll learn a little bit about how it is to be a caregiver, professionally or personally. And I do anticipate that through this day together we'll have some people wandering in and out, and so just we'll invite that to be a part of the flow of the day without it being a distraction. And so with that, just a few things. Some strategies, some story, a little bit about talking about what is this thing called compassion fatigue, some coffee, lunch, a little bit about looking at ourselves and who are we as caregivers. What can we do to enhance our self-care repertoire, and how do we develop resiliency? So at any juncture, please do not hesitate to ask questions. Put up your hands, stop me from talking, share your thoughts. We're going to talk around the tables a fair amount. I hope that we have some fun today together. That you can take a look at your own situation. I'm not going to ask you to speak in front of the group or share any personal information that you don't want to, or no role playing. There's some questionnaires for you to fill out on your own. Small group conversation, video clips, and a little bit of laughter and insight and learning and some breathing together. So if I may just guide you for a minute, you come into this space with a whole lot of things on your plate. Your family concerns, your work concerns, your community concerns. And I would just ask that as much as you're able, just acknowledge those are there and then just put them on the shelf here and here and just let yourself be in this space for just a few hours to breathe and to be nourished. I deeply care about you. I'm only just meeting you, and I deeply care about you. Because I understand that you are making a difference in your communities. Because you're caring for somebody who's family or friend or a client. And so, if we can just for a little bit, just set aside the phone calls and the emails and the texts and the whatever's on our agenda for later today, and just bring all of ourselves just to this place for a minute. You may at any time decline to participate, leave the workshop if something triggers you, decide to observe only, or do an exercise privately without taking part in discussion. So I just say this to create safe space. Why does it matter that we gather on this topic? Well, I'll tell you a quick story. This is a shuttle of sorts, not a very fancy one, for weaving, and this is a loom. A few years ago, many years ago now actually, as I date myself, my wife and I were given a loom. And because she didn't have time to learn how to use it, I went to the Weaving Guild in Camrose and met with a bunch of elder women who taught me how to weave. It was lovely. I was the only man in the group, so I got lots of attention. What they taught me was the wonder and the beauty of these threads. This is the warp, which is on the loom. And the threads across at the bottom here are the weft, which the weaver weaves in. Every cloth, synthetic, natural, doesn't matter. My jacket, your blouses, that's probably not for me. Every cloth in the world is woven somehow. Knitting is a form of weaving. Crocheting is a form of weaving threads together. And what I can tell you is if one of those threads breaks, just one of them, and it's a piece of cloth where it gets lots of, it's on your elbow or somewhere, it will wear a hole in it. And eventually it could affect the integrity of the whole cloth just by one thread breaking. Well, humanity is a group of threads interwoven. That's what a community is. Each of us is a thread. In fact, there's like 7.5 billion threads. 7.5 billion of us. Can you believe that? And get this. Our Creator did not see fit to make any two of us the same. 7.5 billion people, and there's not another one of you. Or you, or you, or you, or you. Which tells me we're extraordinarily important. If this was a diamond and there was not another one of it in the whole world, it would be priceless. So because there's not another thread like me or you, it's important that we take care of that one thread. Because if it gets broken, if I'm a broken person, that weaving becomes undone. But there's a bit of good news. Because, of course, when that one thread breaks, it depends on the weaving around it. And actually, in truth, the other threads around it do provide support to the broken place. And so that is who we are. There's only one of us. And as the fabric of community, we can support those pieces that are broken. And maybe get them retied back together. That is why I feel passionate about the message of compassion, fatigue, and wellness, because as we fill our tank, we are stronger. And we help that fabric of family and community to be stronger. So, with the people at your table, and if you don't like who you're sitting with, you're free to move. Please discuss the following question. And I'll give you a few minutes to talk about it, and then I'll ring this lovely chime to bring you back. With a partner at your table, share 2 qualities about yourself that you treasure. 2 qualities about yourself that you treasure. Yes, if you're not sitting at a table, feel free to join a table just for the discussion. I know I'm going to. All right, go ahead. I didn't introduce the tables or ask you to introduce yourself at the tables. So if you don't know everybody at your table, please just actually take a moment to introduce your name and if you're here for professional or personal reasons. So just, or do you know, does everybody know everybody?
We just did that.
You did that. Okay, good. All right. The other thing is the workbooks that you have in front of you. The workbooks in front of you are yours, and the first page in it, first 2 pages front and back, are for notes, and it kind of gives an outline of the day. We won't touch everything on that outline, but most of that stuff we will. So if you're a note taker, you can certainly just sort of follow that outline on the first page. Okay, don't get too comfortable looking at that though, because right away we're going to jump into this question. This is in regards to your caregiver role. So just by a show of hands, how many here are here for professional caregiver reasons? How many here are in a professional role? Professional, yeah. Okay, hands down. How many here as a personal caregiver? Personal caregivers. Okay, so about half and half.
This is Sue.
Hello, Sue. So I'm going to ask you to share at your tables. Come on in, come on in. Welcome, welcome. No, we expect people in all through the day. So you just come and find a table. You'll be indoctrinated. Why are you doing your caregiver role? Why are you doing it, and is it still working for you? Why are you doing your caregiver role, and is it still working for you? And I'll give you a couple of minutes. Go ahead.
I do hide his clothes so he doesn't get out the things and jump off and get dressed. He's done that and get dressed and get bed.
So I want to just gather these thoughts a little bit. Why are you doing the caregiving that you're doing? Well, let's start over here. I'll just zero. I won't point at you, but I will point at this table. Somebody from this table, why are you doing this caregiving role that you have?
Why I'm doing what I'm doing is it's in relationship, and I don't know how to do anything.
Okay, you don't. Yeah, it's a part of the relationship. Okay.
Makes me feel a better person when I'm losing my worries to take care of someone else.
Makes you feel like a better person when you're losing your worries to help with somebody else. Absolutely. This table, why are you doing what you're doing?
Because there's a need.
There's a need.
And out of love, James.
Okay, and out of love. Yes, we want to be able to state that up front. Much of the caregiving, maybe almost all of the caregiving we do comes from a place of love. Yeah, thank you. Other thoughts? The introverts are still processing this. The extroverts have it right on their tongue. I'm one of the extroverts. Back there, why are you doing what you're doing as a caregiver?
Well, I'm doing it out of love and family relationships. And to keep the seniors in their home a little bit longer,
Yeah.
where they're happier.
Fosters that sense of independence, quality of life. Yeah.
I think most of us are doing what we're doing is because we have somebody that depends on us.
So out of necessity,
Yes.
to a degree. So especially if we're a personal caregiver, that can be the reality. If our spouse or a parent or a child is ill, or just not even ill, just maybe advancing in age and their warranties going off, the necessity arises. Yeah.
I think too, you don't want them sad, lonely, depressed, and feeling deserted. You know, it gives them a happiness to have someone there.
Yes.
Okay, so it can, so it raises their quality of life because you're doing the care you do. Yeah, very good.
And commitment, you mean, Patty?
And commitment.
Commitment. I mean, I've been committed to my husband for 60 years.
60 years. You got married when you were 10?
Yeah.
That is unheard of.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, that,
So you don't quit just because things
no.
got tough.
You might not like it sometimes.
Yeah,
I mean, that's part of it.
that's real.
And to not say you don't like it, well, you're a pretty special person. I'm not there yet.
You know what? It's okay for us to be honest about the hard things.
It is.
And we need a space where we can sit sometimes with people and say, this is hard. It costs a lot emotionally to do this.
Yeah. And that makes a big difference. We have a group of us that meet
Oh, good for you.
just on a private level, and it's wonderful.
Support each other.
Support each other.
Place for some tears and laughter.
That's right. That's right.
My dad died this last spring. He was 91. And the last year, his dementia was kind of exacerbated after he had some medical issues. And he said really weird stuff. And, you know, Mom and I just would listen, and then we'd go back and chuckle because, you know, Dad was in long-term care. Dad would say to Mom, I need you to get the lawnmower out. Mom would say, what do you need that for, Dad? Well, who's going to mow the lawn? And sometimes we cried because we lost something there with Dad. But you can't only cry, you got to also be willing just to laugh at life and my dad's playfulness and the childlikeness that came out in his later days. So, what about here? Why do you do what you're doing?
For myself, it's to give hope to the clients because I work at a rehab center, alcohol and addiction program. Give them hope that there is actually, they are able to come out of their addictions.
Yeah.
Because I too was in the first spot.
I really appreciate that. I want to tell you a story kind of related to that. So I work with men who have perpetrated domestic violence, and they're in a recovery program, and they're starting to realize that they can be more than the hurt that they've caused. So one day I took my wedding ring. Generally you can get that puppy off when it's convenient. I took my wedding ring and I wrapped it in a ball of clay from the road, like a golf ball sized, and I baked it in the sun. So I went to group that night, 14 guys mandated by the courts to be there, some bad guys. In their whole lives, nobody had ever said to them that they were of worth. Can you imagine growing up and just having life kicked out of you and then doing bad stuff and having no understanding of what you were worth? So pass this hunk of clay around to all the guys, and they're all looking at it. I said, what's this worth? They said it isn't worth anything. They're kind of laughing at me. And then I crack it open, wipe it off, and I pass my gold ring around. I said, now what's it worth? Well, their eyes just got huge. And I said, this is humanity so often. We are made out of something beautiful. Regardless of your religious background or theological inclinations, pretty much all religions tell us the same thing, that we were created beautiful. And gold is an element. You can't change it. You can bash it, melt it, do whatever you want. Right down to the atoms, it's still gold. You just can't stop it from being gold. And inside humanity, I hold that there is something beautiful that you just can't change. But if you wrap enough clay around the gold, you'll forget about it. And life gets covered with clay. And we look at each other and we see the clay, that worthless, ugly clay, and we forget to look through the cracks to what's beneath, that beautiful gold. And I told these guys in this group that they were beautiful and that they were created for healing and for good things. And it was dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. The next week they all come back And this one big guy, great big guy, and he was in there for gun offenses and threatening cops and his wife. And he told us this was a worthless course, and he only was there because the courts made him come. And you know what he said? He said, I can't stop thinking about that gold. He says, nobody has ever told me that. If we give hope to somebody, we tell them, you know what, you are more than the wounds that you've received, and you're more than the wounds you've caused, we change the world. That kind of caregiving is costly, to look somebody in the eye and say, I will hold your story of brokenness. I will hold your wounds. I will hold your memory that doesn't work anymore, your confusion. I will hold that, but lightly. And then I will fill my tank so I can keep holding it. That's powerful stuff. Okay, I need 6 volunteers. You're not going to have to say anything. I'm just going to ask you to come right here, and all I'm going to ask you to do is what's going on in that picture. This is my magic floating stick. It's very special. Came off of a broom. And I'm going to ask you to stand and face each other and just hold the stick. And then together, you just have to put it on the floor. And then you're done. So just 6 volunteers, 3 on each side, willing to just put the magic stick on the floor for me. And there's nothing else except that. Oh, come on. Yay! 2 brave souls. 3. 4 brave souls. Do I have 2 more brave souls? There's some reward somewhere in life for this. Oh, perfect. Excellent. All right. So 3 here facing that way and 3 facing this way. All right. Very good. Yeah, I'm just on that side there, love. There we go. Now, what you're going to do is you're going to stick your finger out like that. So you'll need to just come in close. You can bend your finger down if that helps keep the stick on. But just relax for a moment. There's just a couple of rules for this game. I didn't mention that, but okay. Yeah, no, you're committed now. The rules are simple. Your finger can't come off the stick. Okay? So if you just can't, because then that's bad. If you're like almost to the bottom and then I see somebody's finger comes off, you got to start over. All right? And the other rule is you don't want the stick to go up, you just want it to go down. So all you're going to do is you're just going to go down, and then you're just going to drop it on the floor, and then you get to sit down. It's just that simple. We're just that simple, folks. That's all there is to it. All right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I'll just get it set on there. Please keep in mind it's called the magic floating stick. You do want to make sure, you want to keep just enough pressure on that stick that your finger doesn't come off, okay? Because I'll be watching. Okay, are you ready? And go. Okay. Hold on. Wait. Just, you didn't understand the part 2 of the instructions. I want it just to go down, not up. But then again, it is the magic floating stick. So just remember to keep just a little bit of pressure on there. Okay, and there we go. Okay, I'll just keep watching. Don't let your finger come off. Okay. All right. Watch your fingers. Yeah, I'm just keeping an eye on you. 5 women, 1 man. Okay. Oh. Okay. It's wanting to float, isn't it? Now you guys are going down and the stick's not moving. Okay. All right. Oh, look. Oh, okay, I'm just watching your fingers. Yeah. Don't let your finger come off, okay?
Watch it goes up.
I know I could turn around and it would go down, but then you would all have your fingers off. So, you're doing very, very good. Don't let it. All right. Okay, I'm going to relieve you of your stress. Thank you. You may be seated.
That's harder than it looked.
Watch, I'll do it. I'll just show you. Watch. And my fingers stayed on. I have done this exercise with little children and teenagers mixed ages and elders. And I have only seen 2 groups. In about 10 years of doing this exercise, I've only seen 2 groups put it on the ground and legitimately not touch a finger off. Do you know who it would be? What age group? Okay, the wee little kids do it without too much trouble. And at a workshop here just this year, for the first time, I saw a group of mixed age manage to get it on the ground. It was astounding. They were all from one organization. They worked together. Why does the stick go up? Why? I mean, you saw it, like they're holding it, and I say, go down, and it starts to rise. Why does it do that?
Because we don't want to drop it?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right, love. Because you don't want to drop it. Well, you don't want to drop it, and you don't want your finger to come off. So as long as I keep prodding you, oh, I'm watching those fingers, everybody's going, oh, I don't want to be the one person in 6 that my finger comes off, and Bill's going to go, oh, I saw that. Start over. I introduce an element of fear and maybe even of shame into the exercise, artificially, right? I mean, who cares? It's just a game. And yet in the back of our minds, we say, I don't want to be the one that gets singled out. So because there's an element of fear, this stick, with almost every age group, goes up, up, up. And especially, I used to use a pool noodle, and so it's so light you can hardly feel it. It just went like this, whoop, and it would stay up there. No matter, I've never saw the pool noodle with any age go on the floor. It just can't happen. Because all 6 individuals are thinking the same thing, push up on the stick. So I use this exercise to introduce the topic of fear. In our caregiver roles, we have certain fears, whether we be professionals or personal caregivers. And almost all of us are both, even if we're in a professional role, we're probably a caregiver at home to somebody. Name some of the fears that could affect the well-being of your workplace or caregiver role. Some of the fears that could affect the well-being of your workplace or caregiver role. So with the people at your table, just for a minute, what are some of your concerns as a caregiver? I'll give you a couple minutes.
Now, this is your dad you're looking at. Yeah. Is your mother still living?
The things that we are afraid of or that we have concerns about in our caregiving, if unacknowledged, can derail us. We may, for the most part, always have some niggling anxiety or fears. That's fine. It is when they are unspoken that they have a power to take us down paths that we had not intended to go down. What are just a few of the fears in your caregiver role that you shared at the table?
You're going to make a mistake and harm someone.
You might make a mistake and harm someone, absolutely. And again, that could be as a professional or in a personal role, for sure. What happens if I misstep? Yeah.
Or it could be the opposite, maybe wanting them to stay instead of letting them go. That can be, a guilt thing too.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
If family don't think we took good care and they question our caregiving.
Absolutely. Yeah, and especially in professional roles, we can be really vulnerable to a family or some observation on our caregiving. Yeah, thank you.
Sometimes within the family plan, there's the caregiver kind of identified, who also not only has to provide the compassion and caregiving for the family member, but live up to some standard that non-participating siblings place on them, criticize them for what they're doing, even though the sibling may not have any role other than to criticize them. So that's a real balance.
very much so. Thank you.
Ease the family and to caregive the
Yeah. You know, my mom and dad, just mom now, but mom and dad were up at Westlock where I grew up. And I have an elder brother, 10 years older up there in that area. And so because I'm living 2 hours away, my eldest brother, or middle brother, elder brother, was doing the caregiving. And it's tiring for him to be doing that. And I acknowledge that. I do everything I can to support my brother, but I can't, you know, it's a 2-hour drive is a bit to just zip up on a moment's notice. I sense that fear in my brother that he might be judged for his choices in care. And I'm gentle. I seek to be gentle with that because he bears a heavy burden being the one that's closest. But sometimes in families that can be really destructive. So here's what I recommend with our fears or our concerns about our caregiving role. Let us acknowledge them openly with the people in our circle that are involved. If it's professional, as a team, let us sit down sometime and just say, I have a concern about budget cutbacks. I have a concern about supervision. I have a concern about whether I might fail in my role or not be good enough. And as personal caregivers, let us say to our family, I'm worried that I might make a mistake. I'm worried that I might not have enough energy. And if we're open with that, we have a chance to talk together as a team, as a weaving of fabric, and to hold each other. I'd like to share a compassion fatigue story with you. It happens to be one I've lived through. When I was in parish work as a pastor, I had lots of funerals. Sometimes it was parish funerals, sometimes it was community funerals. One particular fall, I had a string of young people die. Yeah. That's the end of the story right there. My wife says I'm twitchy. I don't know what she's talking about. I had a string of young people die in their early 20s from car accidents, rollover and so on. Those are really heavy funerals. Every funeral has its grief and sadness, but when our young adults die, it rips that fabric of a community. And I navigated that all right, but I wasn't terribly aware of the idea of compassion fatigue or one's wellness tank. My tank was getting pretty low. And then came a suicide death, a 16-year-old. I have to tell you that about 25 years earlier at that particular juncture, my brother-in-law had taken his life at 16 years old. I'd just been married for 4 months, and it was my wife's brother. I was 20 years old, and I didn't know how to process that. Prior to that year, I'd never been to a funeral. And then we had a rash of deaths, and one of those was this suicide. So go ahead 25 years, and the school phones me up and says, Bill, we have a suicide. So I went, it wasn't a parishioner, but it was a community member. So I went to the house and I sat with the family and I put my hands out and I held their tears and their anger and their confusion. And I took the funeral and I did the funeral, filled this great big huge church with young people. And about a week afterwards, I put on my calendar, check back with this family, make sure they're accessing their resources, that they have support. When I got to the next week, I looked at my calendar and I thought, good grief, I'm just way too busy. I'll just move it ahead. I had Google Calendar. I just grabbed it and moved it to the next week. The next week came, and this was getting close to November then. I thought, you know what? I'm just going to let it rest for one more week. I've got some things I need to do this week. So I grabbed it on my Google Calendar and I just slid it down to the next week. And you can see a pattern forming. I literally, mindlessly moved it from week to week to week. Somewhere in December I thought, Bill, what are you doing? This is ridiculous. You've got to get a hold of this family. But it was Advent. Busy time in the church here. So I said, January 3rd, when I'm back in the office, I'm phoning them. I'm going to stop in and have a coffee. January 3rd comes, I phone this family's neighbor who was a parishioner just to get a heads up. How are they doing? I want to go in and stop in and see them. Do you know what she says? They moved away. I was just ill. I felt like I had utterly failed. How could I not go back to this family and check on them? And then they move away. Do you know what happened? I had trauma from 25 years earlier that I never dealt with. I didn't process. I hadn't acknowledged that residing in me. And 25 years later, similar circumstances, a young 16-year-old takes his own life, and all of that trauma washes over me again, and I could not bring myself to face that family one more time. In great part because my tank was just scratching bottom, my wellness tank. I had nothing left. I was tired on the inside. I'm not prone to tears. There's nothing wrong with being prone to tears. I just don't tend to be. So I know if I have tears welling out, there's something going on in me. And I would go to work and sit at my desk and I'd want to cry, and I had no particular reason for it. I said to my wife, I want to cry all the time. She says, Bill, you got to do something. You're burning your candle at both ends. So let's take a look at this thing together. This thing that can make us want to cry, can make us want to feel so angry and prickly with the people around us, can make us feel like we want to walk away. Mostly, we are not trained in compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma. Now, it is getting to be more of a hot topic, which is why Kathy invited me here with you. But if you went through training as a counselor or a nurse or a doctor or a teacher or a pastor or any number of things, any time earlier than the last 5 years, you probably did not receive training on this. And the reality is we work in deeply compromised systems. Healthcare does good work, but it's a broken system. Our education system does good work, but it's a broken system, right? We are not always adequately trained. I mean, if we're doing personal caregiving, we might not have any training. Nobody trained my mom on how to care for my dad, except just life trained her. That can be stressful. There are ongoing challenges and cutbacks. We might be looking for some money to help us care for a family member, and we can't find the right grant or access monies for something that would be beneficial. And at work, there's always more need than time and money. There's always more clients than we can service. That's just the reality. We hear difficult stories. We might live with a difficult story. I think for Mom, 93-year-old Mom, when Dad died in June, I think even more than that deep sadness after 66 years of dating the same guy, I think she had relief. She had relief that she didn't have another day where she had to be in this role that was so hard. And the emotion within these stories can stick to us. That suicide funeral stuck to me. And I'm going to show you a video clip. And the video clip is of a guy somewhere in Eastern Europe working in a factory of some sort. And the factory, I don't know what they build, but they get metal filings all over the floor. And so he came up with this ingenious method to clean up some of the metal filings. It's a magnet, a big, huge magnet in a plastic bucket. And what you can see is the filings stick to the outside of the bucket because they're attracted to the magnet. Now, how do I get the filings off, he says. Pull the magnet out, and the filings drop off. And then he does it again. He picks up so many that it exceeds the magnetic field of the magnet, and they start dripping off. And he pulls it out. Boop. They all fall off. That's how we are. Most of us, if we are at all empathetic or compassionate, as we go through our day of caregiving, the energy, the emotion of the people around us can stick to us. So I do a lot of grief counseling and care. And I'll get 3 clients maybe in a day. I don't have a heavy load, but if I get 3 clients in a day who are in deep grief, that every one of them, the emotion washes over me. And some of it just sticks to my heart. I'd go to see Dad. I might be up to Westlock for a couple days and pop in and see Dad. And I would generate my own emotion to see Dad's suffering. Now, if we generate our own, we're responsible for processing that and letting it flow through us in a way. But if I'm with you and I'm bathed in your emotion, that's not mine. And I need to find a way to leave somebody else's emotion at the door, to pull the magnet out, so to speak, and let that emotion drop off of me. Even if it's my spouse I'm caring for, or my parents, or a friend, I still have to find a way to separate, to let their emotion be their own, and to be responsible for mine. Because that's too much for a human being to carry. We can't carry the emotion of the world on our shoulders. So one of the strategies for building resiliency is to know, how do I let the emotion of others slide off of me? I can hold it for a while with them, but then there comes a time to let that go, metaphorically. A couple of authors you may be interested in, if you want to read about this: Karen Sack-Vitney and Lorianne Perlman, 2 trauma nurses that did early work on vicarious trauma. Charles Figley, one of the early writers on compassion fatigue. And on page 1, 2, 3, 4 of your booklet is a list of suggested reading. So it's on the back side of page 3. So at the very bottom on page 4 there, you'll see these books listed. Laura Vandernoot Lipsky's book, Trauma Stewardship, is just fantastic. And as is Francois Mathieu's book, The Compassion Fatigue Workbook. And all are available on Amazon or Google or wherever you buy fine books. These 5 people kind of produced the groundwork for understanding the signs and symptoms of this thing.
Here's to you, trying to make the world a better place. You take on the weight of it all, knowing there will be a cost, never expecting to pay full retail for it. After a while, you notice something's getting to you. You're changing. You've been there. We've all been there. The answers just aren't all that easy anymore. someday, in fact, be you. Hey, it's a struggle. We understand that. Doesn't mean it's too late for a change. We're here. We get it. And we have ideas for how to find a better way. Check us out. TraumaStewardship.com.
TraumaStewardship.com is Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky's website, and I want to acknowledge her work in producing this video and giving us permission to view it. So we're going to look at 4 things: compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, moral distress, and burnout. Compassion fatigue, caregiver fatigue, the same thing. Compassion fatigue is a deep erosion of our compassion, of our ability to tolerate strong emotions or difficult stories in others. Francois Mathieu said it is the profound emotional and physical exhaustion that helping professionals and caregivers can develop over the course of time. A gradual erosion of the things that keep us connected to others in our caregiver role. An erosion of empathy and hope and compassion for both others and for ourselves. It is evident in both professional and personal life, and of course it can happen in personal caregiving. Charles Figley said it is the cost of caring. If you dare to be a caregiver, you will experience some fatigue. It is an occupational hazard, he said. It is not a pathology. It's not a disease. It is not a psychological illness. It is an occupational hazard. If you are a carpenter, you may smack your thumb with a hammer. You will likely get slivers if you're a carpenter. That's an occupational hazard. So if you're going to dare to step into that ground, that holy ground of caregiving, you will have fatigue sometimes. Francois Mathieu said, in compassion fatigue, we start to see changes in our personal and professional lives. We can become dispirited, increasingly bitter. We may contribute to a toxic work environment. We may be prone to professional errors. We may violate client boundaries or lose a respectful stance towards our clients. It's a little bit like water seeping into a basement. I had a home one time that had a cinder block basement. And as the years went by, the block shifted ever so slightly, and there was just some seepage of water. If I was diligent and kept up with that seeping water, it wasn't a problem. However, if I didn't pay attention to it for a few weeks, I'd have puddles. Compassion fatigue is like that. If we are attentive to our wellness, we can keep ahead of the game. But if we go for weeks or months or years without having done any self-care, our basement's going to be flooded. Vicarious trauma. This is coined by Lorianne Perlman and Karen Sackvitney. And it is repeated exposure to difficult stories that change our view of the world. It is a profound shift that caregivers experience in their worldview when their care receivers or clients have experienced trauma. A change in your fundamental beliefs about the world are altered. And it's tricky because it's not our personal trauma, it's the trauma stories of other people. And let me give you some examples. Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky, whose video we just watched, is a trauma therapist. She worked for years and years, hearing the hardest stories of brokenness and wounding you can imagine. One year, she went on a trip to Indonesia with her husband and in-laws. And they're standing over on this cliffside, overlooking a great big, huge, gorgeous bay, like something out of a postcard. And everybody's in their own quiet thoughts, just being in the moment of that beauty. And then Laura thinks to herself, I wonder how many people have jumped off this cliff. Be a good suicide spot. Then she thinks, I wonder how far it is to the nearest trauma center. And then she realized she said that out loud. And her family steps back and looks at her and says, why, in the name of God's green earth, would you think of those things? And that's when it first hit her how the stories of over years had changed the lens through which she looks at the world. Like a cop who's off duty and she's walking down the street and she's still scanning everywhere, still on full alert. Or a child protective services worker who's in line at the grocery store and she hears a child crying and immediately looks around to think, this has got to be a situation I have to deal with. So when the hard stories of your care receivers change how you see the world, that's called vicarious trauma. It happens when there are inconsistencies. It can cause nightmares, difficulty getting rid of certain images, an intense preoccupation with a particular story. It's cumulative. It could be one big story changes your worldview, but it's most likely going to be over time. It can contribute to PTSD. And in fact, therapists, counselors, whoever, caregivers, can exhibit signs of PTSD as a consequence of the stories they've been exposed to. Now, there's a difference between one's own trauma, primary trauma, and vicarious or secondary trauma. Here's primary trauma. When I was 20, my 16-year-old brother-in-law killed himself. I was a part of that family weaving that became my trauma, my story. The story of the fellow at the school whose funeral I did, that was somebody else's trauma, not mine. That was secondary trauma. It was a story that I was exposed to. If you are a caregiver to a family member, you are a part of that story. Those hard things are your story. That's primary trauma. If you're a professional and you're with a client, that's secondary trauma that's you're being exposed to. Any questions about that?
So are you saying with vicarious trauma, the results of it can be every bit as severe as if they had happened to us ourselves?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So generally not from one story, but it could be. But regardless, we take the trauma of that story into ourselves because we're compassionate, because we're empathic, right? And because the story of the magnet and that filings, so that trauma story sticks to us. If we don't know how to build resiliency, to let your trauma be yours and to separate myself from it, then we become susceptible to that trauma. And we may start exhibiting signs of post-traumatic stress disorder in terms of invasive imagery, inability to sleep, anger, those kind of things.
So the PTSD symptoms that could come as a result of this, it just makes it every bit as real. Could you just actually say that you can actually get PTSD?
You can.
Primarily through vicarious trauma?
Yeah, so originally PTSD was understood as only belonging to primary trauma, personally experienced trauma. But in these last years, research has shown that repeatedly therapists or long-term caregivers are showing the same symptoms as PTSD in primary trauma, and it's being treated essentially the same way then. And all of this to say, we don't want to take this lightly. Like the load that we as caregivers bear is heavy, and it can undo us. We want to pay attention to signs and symptoms, and we're going to get to those in just a moment. Moral distress is when policies or routines conflict with beliefs about client care. Here's an example. Let's say you work as a nurse in an acute care setting. And you know that if you gave your patient another dose of pain meds, it would relieve their agony. But the doctor's orders, the standing orders are that they can't have their pain meds for another 2 hours. And you can't get a hold of the doctor to change that. You want to relieve their suffering, but the policies say you must contact the doctor, and the doctor's not available. Or you work in a setting where you have clients that are coming to you for counseling. And you really earnestly believe that if you contacted one of their friends, let's say, that's a main support in their life, you could connect them in an important way in this, but your policies state you can't do that. And so you feel bound. What you believe is right, you can't do because of the policies. That puts you in a state of moral distress. And for sure and certain, it will drain your tank. You can just hear it like a bathtub. Your energy draining when you are in moral distress. If you are in moral distress often in your role, you will have to leave that role. Or resolve the moral distress with changing of policies. And finally, just look at burnout quick. We're looking at burnout from a clinical sense. So not burnout as in I'm burned out from shopping for Christmas presents, or I'm burned out from eating too much good chocolate. Right? It's burnout in a clinical sense, which is physical and emotional exhaustion as a result of prolonged stress and frustration. A depleted ability to cope with work demands. Feeling powerless to achieve goals. Now, it can happen in our personal caregiving, but I just want to be really clear. It's related to a toxic work environment. And it might be toxic because of the administration or policies, or it might only be toxic for you. Maybe it just doesn't work for you, but everybody else is fine. But something about the place you work or do your caregiving is toxic for you, and that means it's poisoning you. How do I know if it's burnout or compassion fatigue? So, let's say I'm working for Canada Post at your local post office. And I'm burned out, like I'm fried. I'm going on stress leave every other week. And I say, that's it, I've had it, and I quit. And I go up to Fort, what's it slips up there? What is it? No, just down the road. Fort Macleod. I wanted to say Fort Mackay. I knew that wasn't right. Thank you. You go up to Fort Macleod and you get a job at Canada Post there. And all of a sudden everything's good. Like 2 days into it, like you feel like you're a new woman or a new man or whatever breed you are. And it's just great. That's burnout. Burnout is a toxic environment, and if we change the environment, our tank goes whoop right up to the top. Compassion fatigue is, I was working at the nursing home here in Cardston, and I couldn't take it anymore, so I quit, and I went to the nursing home in Fort Macleod, and I still feel awful. Because compassion fatigue means your tank is empty, and it's going to be empty no matter where you go, unless you are intentional about filling it. Burnout is you're swimming in a toxic environment, and when you get out of that and swim in a healthy environment, everything's good. Questions?
This burnout thing is my story.
My body said I couldn't do anymore. With it just, I thought I was fine, but ended up going to the hospital in an ambulance. My health was gone, and I knew that my body said I just couldn't do it anymore. And within a couple of weeks, my wife died because I turned her over to the public system.
Oh, that's brutal.
It was just because a buildup of stress over time.
Yes, yeah.
My body, I just said, that's it, I can't do it, and then quit on me. I was taking support, I would go to support groups, support group, and was, thought I was doing everything right. And I thought everything was going fine. But I just didn't understand or realize the stress I was under. And it was just cumulative. It just
It kept building up.
kept building up over a period of time. And finally, my body just couldn't take it anymore.
How long ago was this?
This was a little over 3 years ago.
So Gabor Mate has a book called When Your Body Says No, The Hidden Cost of Stress. And he writes about just exactly what you're describing, about being attentive to your body, because your body is going to absorb this stress. And at its worst, it will literally affect our core systems. So you were a personal caregiver in this story, right, to your wife?
Yes.
Yeah. And so that's particularly challenging for you that are caregivers in your personal realm, because it can be toxic. And I'm not imposing this story on yours, but just it can happen where our loved one might not be very nice sometimes. And we're facing that day after day. That is toxic for us, and we can't step out of it, or we don't know how to step out of it. And the cost can be huge, as your story exhibits. You have my deepest compassion. And I'm so grateful that obviously you've recovered somewhat because you're here with us today.
Yes, I've had to become my own self-caregiver.
Yeah,
In order to regain my health again.
of course.
I had to totally eliminate stress from my life in order to regain my health again. But I came very close to losing my own life.
You could be facilitating this today. Yeah, you gained wisdom and experience the hard way. Yeah. Thank you for that story. How do I know if I have compassion fatigue or I'm struggling with depression? Depression is a recognizable mental illness defined in the DSM. I think we're at DSM-5 now. I didn't update that. Compassion fatigue is more of an occupational hazard for those in the helping professions, akin to an on-the-job type of safety hazard. Chronic compassion fatigue can lead to depression and other mental illnesses, and a history of depression can make one more vulnerable to compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma. But there are two different things. You go to your doc and you say, I feel like I'm depressed. And if your doctor is attuned and trauma trained, they will check for compassion fatigue. And if you have compassion fatigue, they will not likely give you antidepressants. Why? Because compassion fatigue merely needs a wellness routine to counteract it. Clinical depression often needs to be treated medically. So they're two separate things, but they can exacerbate each other. Rachel Naomi Raymond, MD, wrote the book Kitchen Table Wisdom. I highly recommend it. If you're only going to buy one book, buy hers. It will make you feel like $1 million. It'll remind you of the incredible gift that you are to this world because of your caregiving. The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. It is going to hit us physically, behaviorally, and psychologically. And on page 3 of your workbook, you have this list of signs and symptoms. So if you're a note taker, you can just relax for a minute. Page 3 on the left-hand side of the page. Physical signs and symptoms. Physical exhaustion. I'm tired on the inside. You know, after I did that string of funerals that one fall and had that suicide funeral, I went home and I had nothing left for my wife or my children. The dog and I were getting on okay, but the rest of the family? Yeah. My funeral director friend says, sometimes I go home and my wife takes one look at my face and she says, I'm getting leftovers today, aren't I? Meaning emotional leftovers. And that's how it is. When we are empty with compassion fatigue, we feel tired in our soul. It's not that we couldn't go for a long walk. It's not that our bodies are just tired. It's that we can't find the motivation inside us to get up and go for a long walk. Because we're beat. We're beat down. We might have insomnia or hypersomnia. We either can't get to sleep or we sleep all the time and never feel better. Headaches and migraines. Somatization. Somatization, fancy word meaning our body hurts because of our emotions. Our body responding to emotional stress. Just like exactly what you said, sir. That story you told us is about somatization, where my body is reacting to the stress in my life. So you might get achy joints. Your digestion could be all upset. Your breathing, your heart rate. All in response to your tank being empty. Fainting spells, nausea, anxiety, hypervigilance. And here's that book I referred to, When the Body Says No, The Cost of Hidden Stress by Gabor Mate, who's also an MD, Canadian MD. So your body is going to feel the stress of this work, of caregiving. You are also going to see changes in your behavior. So you could have increased use of drugs or alcohol, or other kinds of addictions, including thought addictions. Absenteeism, right? So you phone into work, yeah, I can't come in today, I'm sick, and I'm going to be sick next Wednesday as well, and probably Friday, just so you know. What if you're a personal caregiver? How do you have absenteeism? How do you say to your loved one, I'm not going to be in today? Every single public workshop I've done, I've had somebody come up to me, generally an elder, man or a woman, and tell me this story. Hold this story with me for a minute. Bill, I'm caring for my spouse. And I need them to be in long-term care now. I can't do it anymore. And they break down in tears. I just can't do it anymore. But they don't want to go. They won't let me do it. And I look at this man or woman and I hold their tears for a moment. And then I say, look, I get their fear. I haven't been there, but I appreciate the fear of moving out of their home. And the longing to stay in one's own place where you have lived. But they don't have the right to drain your tank like that. Every workshop, somebody has come to me and said, Bill, I have to get my spouse in long-term care and they won't go. How can we have absenteeism when we live with our care receiver? What about a new mom whose husband works on the rigs and is gone for 3 weeks at a time, or a single mom? 24/7, and she's got a colicky baby, and maybe a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old and a 12-year-old, an 18-year-old. And she is on all the time, and she can't afford to bring somebody into the home. We forget some of the people in our communities that are deeply embedded in caregiving, and can't get away from it for a break. And their compassion fatigue is so deep. This isn't just about professionals or those whose spouse needs care. Exaggerated sense of responsibility. Nobody else can do it. I have to do it. Avoidance of certain clients or patients. Impaired ability to make decisions. Forgetfulness. Problems in your personal relationships. Attrition, which means turnover at work. Compromised care of clients and patients, or silencing. Probably the biggest one, though, is right here, anger and irritability. I'll tell you what, if you want to know how your tank is, what the level on it is, ask your family or friends to tell you about your anger. Just use this, okay? Let's say it's one of your friends. You trust them. I want you to tell me about my anger. I promise I won't blow up at you. I just want to hear it. I'm going to actually put my tongue between my teeth and just bite on it. And they might say, you know, Bill, you have been pretty prickly lately. And then I need to listen to that and think, okay, what does that mean? What's going on in me? Or they might say, Bill, once in a while you're prickly, but most of the time I can handle you. Ask somebody you trust about your anger. What does it look like? If they love you and they trust you, they will tell you. Jody Carrington. If you want to have a really good speaker in, host Jody Carrington from Olds, Dr. Jody Carrington, to speak on connecting. And we just had her up in Camrose for a child grief seminar. She was spectacular. And she says anger is sad with armor on. Or she also says mad. Mad is sad with armor on. So if you are feeling angry and prickly, go underneath there. There's a deep sadness. If you have clients or care receivers that are angry, go slide underneath the anger, which is armor, and find that deep sadness and hold that with them. If you are angry, listen to your sadness. Psychological signs and symptoms. So our thoughts are also going to be saying something to us about our well-being. Emotional exhaustion. Moving it from on my Google Calendar from this week to this week to this week for 2.5 months. I just feel crazy telling you the story because I can't believe I did that. I was emotionally exhausted, and so I just kept distancing myself from that family without being mindful of it. Negative self-image, depression, a reduced ability to feel sympathy or empathy, cynicism and embitterment, resentment, dread of working with certain clients, feeling professional helplessness, a diminished sense of enjoyment in life, depersonalization, a disruption of my worldview, and heightened anxiety or irrational fears, hypervigilance, loss of hope, an increased sense of personal vulnerability or an inability to tolerate strong feelings, problems with intimacy, intrusive imagery, and either a hypersensitivity to emotionally charged stimuli or an insensitivity to it. You can either become like, every little thing is a trauma for you, or you just got your shields up and you don't feel anything at all. Difficulty separating personal and professional life, and a failure to mature and develop non-work-related aspects of life. If you resonate with any of these symptoms, I want to say thank you and congratulate you for your caregiving. All of these symptoms, physical, behavioral, psychological, are the dashboard of your life. So I was driving down here yesterday, and it was +6 at some places, and then +2, and then it got down to about 1. And I had a little bing on my dash and a little snowflake on the dashboard that told me it was getting cold enough, I should be careful, it might be icy. I said, there's not even a drop of moisture anywhere. Don't worry about it, car. But it was like just warning me. Like when your gas gauge gets low and you get that little bing and the little gas tank thing lights up. And it says, hey, your tank is low, pull over and fill up. All of these symptoms are little warning lights on your dashboard. They're not telling you that you've failed or that you're a bad person. They're saying you've done such a spectacular job as a caregiver and your tank is getting low. Please pull over and fill your tank. That's all. So if you're feeling a little prickly or you're tired on the inside or your joints are achy or any of dozens of symptoms, your being is saying to you, well done. Now it's just time to pull it back for a moment and take care of you. Comments or questions? Okay, so when you're in green, you can change the world, honestly. Like if you understand that you are like pure gold or pure light on the inside of you, just a gift from God to this world. And your tank is mostly full, people will hardly be able to stand to be around you. There's so much light and love pouring out of you. Now, on a particularly hard day, you might get into the yellow zone. Maybe your personal caregiving just was really costly that day. The one you're loving they were just hard to be with. Or maybe your clients had really hard stories and you had a real long string of clients that day. And so you bounce into yellow and it's like, you get a little light going ding, ding, meaning sometime today, please stop and fill your tank. That's okay, because later in the day, you'll be back down to green again. If you spend most of your time in the yellow zone, it's okay, but it's not being at your best. If you jump into red, that's when you get the experience of your body breaking down. Again, that doesn't mean you're a bad person. It means you're just really, really good at caring for others, and you suck at caring for yourself. Or you just didn't realize you needed to. Or you didn't know how to. We cannot stay in red very long because it actually causes a breakdown of our physiological being. On Sunday, I get to go up to Vegreville and do a presentation to their Palliative Care Association, a longest night service, remembering those we've lost in the last year, with an incredible palliative nurse consultant named Karenza Pidrabeski. Karenza sometimes comes with me on these gigs. She tells her story, and I have permission to share it with you, and it goes like this. All day long, Karenza goes from client to client who is at end of life, some stage in palliative care. She's brilliant. Young mom, married. A couple years ago, her mom back in Britain died, and she went back for the service, and she didn't quite know how to grieve that. She brought that grief back home to Canada, and she continued on her daily routine of caring for her family, caring for people who are so vulnerable. One day in January, her husband comes home and the front door is wide open. And he walks in the house and Karenza is standing at the stove in the kitchen. The stove's not on. Karenza, he says, "What you doing?" She says, I don't know. He closes the door. "What do you mean you don't know? What's going on?" "I don't know," she says. And then she starts to cry. And she can't stop. And he sits her down on the couch and he holds her. And she just sobs right down to the core of her being. And he phones her supervisor and she gets put on leave. and she accesses her employee assistance program, and she gets hooked up eventually with a trauma-trained counselor. And over a few months and months and months, she slowly begins to fill her tank. She was in red, and her brain had literally shut down. It said, I will not allow you to move one more step until you care for yourself. That's what her brain said. It shut her down. It took half a year for her to begin to get her feet under her, for her to have enough resiliency to go back into her work. And she did. She went back to being a palliative care nurse. And she sat down with her family and she said, I cannot do it all. You have to help. And they did. And she's a beautiful, brilliant light in this world. Okay, with the people at your table, to the degree that you're comfortable, share, how do you know, what do your thoughts and your action and your body tell you when you've got into the yellow zone? How do you know you're into yellow? I'll just give you a few minutes. Let's collect our thoughts. A couple of signs and symptoms. I know I'm in my yellow zone when? Irritable. When I'm irritable. Very good.
Flight.
Sorry?
Flight.
Flighty. You want to just get out of there. Okay, so thank you for bringing that up. Fight, flight, or freeze. So when we're traumatized and our hindbrain is leading the score instead of our forebrain, right? So have you guys seen this image? This is your brain. Here's your brainstem, your neocortex, your prefrontal lobes. All your cognitive, rational, creative thought, all that comes from this chunk here. When you are traumatized, bing, and this is flipped, you flip your lid, all you're working on is your amygdala and your hindbrain, and that's your fight, flight, or freeze section. So when your 2-year-old has a tantrum, bink, their lid is flipped. When your spouse has a tantrum, their lid is flipped. When you are really stressed, bing, you physiologically, you cannot have cognitive, rational thought when this happens. You are operating on your hindbrain, your instinctive level. And in order to think rationally and process what's going on, you have to be calmed down enough to bring that back around and re-engage this big, huge frontal lobe. It doesn't think as quickly as this hindbrain, but it does the rational processing bit. So when you are flighty, when I just want to get out of Dodge, you know that this has moved out of the way and you're reacting from back here. Just by the way, this is Jody Carrington stuff. You want to connect with somebody who's in this state, be they a 2-year-old or an 80-year-old, first, calm them down, help them be regulated, bring that back down, then start to talk with them about what's going on, because they are unable to process when they're like this. We bring it back down, then we can start to make sense of things. Thank you. Other signs and symptoms. I know I'm in my yellow zone when?
Can't sleep.
Can't sleep. Your brain's just going over stuff. You just can't get yourself shut down. You know what that's trying to tell me is I'm going to remind you that we're going to have lunch in 12 minutes and 43 seconds.
When you don't talk.
Okay, when you shut down, you close people off, you pull inside, you isolate. Here's how it goes. You're in your green zone. You drive up to your driveway, garage at the front of your house. Your neighbor's out on the front lawn working on something. His wife's there. Hey, Bob. Hey, Jean. You get right out of the car. You stop. You pull out. Hey, how are you guys doing? Good to see you again. Get back in, go in the garage. When you're in your yellow zone, you pull up to your garage. You roll the window down. Hey, Bob. Hey, Jean. And you go into the garage. You go in the house, and you don't want to see anybody. When you're in your red zone, you drive up. You go like this. You go into the garage. You get out. You go to the basement. And you put your pajamas on. Right? You get that. Okay. So when we isolate, that could be a sign that our tank is low. So what you want to do is be aware of your baseline. When I am in my basic green, low yellow zone, what's my baseline? Well, I tend to be an introvert, so I am going to be a little bit more to myself, but I like going out and seeing people. That's my baseline, let's say. When I'm in high yellow zone, I don't want to see anybody. I've dropped below my baseline. If I'm an extrovert, my son-in-law is an extrovert. Like to him, if you're by yourself, that's a waste of time. If he was on a desert island, he'd self-combust. So his baseline is, I want to see people 97% of the time. He can tell if his tank's low if he only wants to see people 75% of the time. I'm an introvert. I want to see people about 50% of the time at best. If I only want to see people 10% of the time, I got to ask myself what's wrong. So just know what your baseline is, and if you move below that, that's a warning light. One last one. How do you know you're in your yellow zone?
Physical things, ticks, twitches.
Physical things. So your body starts to respond to the stress. Yeah, for sure. And then that prickly thing, right? When we're short-tempered with the people that we trust the most. So, and that's going to happen not necessarily at work, it might, but it's sure going to happen with your partner, your children, your dog, your cat, your horse, your siblings. They're going to get the brunt of it because you trust them enough to let them see how empty you are. I just want to close off this morning's portion. Well, we're going to get back to that in just a minute with some statistics. Depending on the studies, as between 40 to 85% of helping professionals were found to have compassion fatigue or high rates of vicarious trauma. So at the very least, almost half have significantly low tanks, and up to 85%. 48% of the total social workforce in the US, high levels of personal distress. "6,000 school counselors in the States that have some mental or emotional impairment because of compassion fatigue. Saskatchewan teachers, 40% of those surveyed had to take time off work because of stress, almost half. 61% reported becoming ill. Get this, half of them said they would quit and do something else if they could get another job that paid decently. How about you who are personal caregivers? Oh, you, as if I'm not. We're all personal caregivers to somebody, friend or family. In Stats Canada reports the following effects of personal caregiving. Tired, worried or anxious, overwhelmed, alone or isolated, angry or irritable, unhappy, depressed, loss of appetite, sleep problems, health consequences, overall health suffered. Responsibilities were physically strenuous, had consulted a health professional, and had suffered injuries while caregiving. How's that for a job description? Please apply. Great benefits. That's real. This is what Canadians reported in their personal caregiving. They did not include, however, the fact that you are pouring love into the world and making a difference, that somebody's livelihood and quality of life depend on you, and that's a rich and brilliant thing. However, this is the cost of that kind of caregiving. People who care for or help their partner or child are the most likely to have an elevated level of psychological distress called compassion fatigue. So grandparents at the low end, if you're caring for a grandparent, there's a 10% increase in your distress. Friend, neighbor, or colleague, 15%. Father-in-law, mother-in-law, or other family member, about 22%. Father or mother, about 28%. Spouse moves it up to almost 50%. And son and daughter is the highest level, just over 50%. A 50% increase over your baseline. So if my baseline stress is here, and I'm caring for any of these groups, it is going up like that. Yeah, go ahead.
Some of us could have two of those amounts. Could have a mother and a spouse.
Indeed.
Like, so
So,
it would affect,
so,
okay. Like you may not just be, you could have three. Like you may not just fall into one category.
my sister-in-law, my wife's sister, was a registered nurse. You know that right there. You know what they say about nurses? Nurses eat their young. It means that they're expected to be tough in the face of unbelievable demands. My sister-in-law was a nurse. Her 15-year-old son was diagnosed with lung cancer. So at the same time she is nursing, she has a 15-year-old with lung cancer, and a year and a half later, she's quit nursing. Her son is palliative, and her husband becomes ill, and they separate. So you do all three of those, right? So I don't know how she survived, honestly. She did. We buried that boy a year ago this month. And her husband and her never got back together. So I tell you that to emphasize this, that we can have multiple layers. She had professional drain on her tank. She had care for a child draining her tank, and she had distress in her marriage draining her tank. And that is real life, right? We rarely are just looking at one dashboard in our life. We're looking at the dashboard of our personal relationship, of our caregiving with family and friends and neighbors, our professional work. Oh, and I forgot, how about care of myself? Where's that dashboard in there? All studies come to the same conclusions. Compassion, fatigue, and vicarious trauma affect the most caring. We must remember that when we have colleagues or friends that crash, they are not diseased. It is not contagious. We are not to blame them. We are to recognize, put a pin on them, a badge that says, I was deeply caring and I gave everything I had. The percent of traumatic cases on a caseload exacerbates the incidence of vicarious trauma. Full-time versus part-time. It's just a matter of how much is draining your tank. Part-time drains it less than full-time. Availability of social support. If you're a personal caregiver, are you a part of a support network that can help? Helper's own trauma history contributes. Like if your brother-in-law killed himself, for instance, just saying, that could affect your effectiveness down the road. Effective training is protective. If you've been well trained for whatever your role is, if you've gone to workshops or courses. So client stories, lack of resources, the climate of the workplace or the caregiver situation, personal life factors, your relationship or identification with the person who's receiving care, just like that chart showed. Your working conditions, risk of personal injury, insufficient training, working in isolation, all of this exacerbates how quickly that tank drains. So Laura van der Lipsky sums it up. The main factors contributing to this continuum are your personal and current life factors and your work situation. And then Francois Mathieu says, can we prevent compassion fatigue? Is that the purpose of gathering here today? We're going to prevent this from happening? And she says, no, get your head out of the sand. We're always going to be draining our tank a little bit, but can we work towards resiliency, towards learning how to fill our tank even as it drains? Yes, that we can do. On a professional level, we do have to ask ourselves, how many cases are too many? And in the broken system, there will always be way more cases than there is time or resources. And at some point, we have to say, I won't do any more.
I didn't realize how
tank was, because I had trained my body to be on call for 24 hours. And so my body filled that role. But
Until it rebelled.
yeah, but I didn't know how full my tank was or how much resilience I had, or I just said I'm going to do it, and I did it, and I've trained myself that way. And after my wife passed away, it took me a long time to be able to train my body to sleep again. Initially, I had to go on sleeping pills and stuff like that, and I would sleep, but I wouldn't rest. And finally had to learn to train my body how to sleep again, because I trained it to always be on call.
Yeah. You are addressing something we'll talk about after lunch, which is being mindful or self-aware, listening to ourselves to hear what are we learning about our current state. Well, I think that we can probably draw this to a close for now. There's always more bits to look at, but I do want us to take a moment to leave this and prepare ourselves for our meal. Kathy will give us instructions. And before we eat, I would just like to say a word of thanks for the food that we're going to eat, by way of a story. Everything we put in our mouths is grown by a farmer. It might be us, we might be the farmer. It might be our backyard farm. It might be grown somewhere else on another continent. It might be a big commercial farm. But every bit of food is grown by some kind of a farmer whose hands touch soil and work hard. And then that food is transported by somebody. I mean, unless we just went to the backyard and grabbed it. And it's brought to places where it's processed. And somehow, by many, many hands and many hours of hard work, it makes its way into this building, where again, by hard work and several hands, it is turned into our food, and food that's going to fill our tank. And do we not know that even all those hands across many lands growing and getting this food to us, it is all by the gift of the earth, and soil and water and sunshine, things far beyond anything we had anything to do with. And so our gratitude, we find in us that place of gratitude that so many people and the gift of the earth and the gift of God brought to us food for our sustenance. And so we say thank you. And with that, we close our morning. And I invite you to stand and stretch and go outside and get some fresh air. And Kathy, how do we do food?
Just line up, and it's just self-serve. Just come and get it. It'll be at the table here.
Very good. Self-serve at the table. I leave you to it. And we're back, live in Cardston, Alberta. Kathy, could you do me a favor and just ask the women from the kitchen to come out and receive our thanks?
Yes.
Please. Are you fed up? Come, yeah, they're going to come out. Just wait. Just wait for it. Thunderous applause in just a moment. Here they go. Yay! Woohoo! Thank you for your hard work and your lovely food. When I was growing up, I'd go to visit a friend in Westlock, maybe have supper there. My mom said to me probably 5 times before I left the house, make sure you say thank you. And she's 93, in reasonably good health. And I've never forgotten that lesson of gratitude that she instilled in me, especially for food. If I go to somewhere like a cafeteria and I fill up a plate, I'll go back to the kitchen staff after and thank them for their hard work. Because what a gift to have somebody else prepare food, that we didn't have to work for. Okay, so we're just going to finish up with one thing from our morning stuff, and then we're going to launch into how do we keep this tank full. In your booklets, on page 5, 6, and 7, is something called the ProQOL, or Professional Quality of Life Inventory. I would invite you, when you have a quiet moment at home, to answer these questions on page 5, marking 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 in front of each item. And then when you turn to page 7, it tells you how to score it. And what it's going to tell you is, right now, how much compassion, satisfaction do I have in my caregiver role? How much burnout am I experiencing? And how much vicarious or secondary trauma am I experiencing? And then on page 6, it just explains a little bit about what those numbers mean. And it will give you a snapshot for right at the time when you do that assessment. So if you do it on a really hard day, your assessment will be different than if you do it on the day when you just get back from fishing all afternoon. Well, unless it's my wife fishing, because she's not very good at it, but.